And we're very happy to be here for the third installment of Early Christian Response to Disease, and to have Professor Larry Welborn of Fordham University lead us again.
I'm very happy to be back with you. Actually, I love this medium. I love how interactive it is, how we get to know each other. And I received a couple of really wonderful emails following our last class, and I would welcome others. Peter, you may want to pass on my email address. It is simply Welborn, W-E-L-B-O-R-N, just one L, Welborn at Fordham.edu, in case anyone has a follow-up question or comment.
And I've included that in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, as you know, 2 weeks ago, we began exploring the early Christian response to disease and to pandemic. And we began with the two most destructive, horrible pandemics in ancient history, the so-called plague of Galen in 165, and then the measles epidemic, apparently, that broke out in 251. We began there because we had eyewitness accounts of the progress of the disease and how people responded to it variously. On the one hand, we had the Dr. Galen, who witnessed the arrival of the smallpox epidemic in Rome before he fled deep into the heart of what is now Turkey. And then for the measles epidemic in 251 AD, we had first-hand accounts by Dionysius of Alexandria and Cyprian of Carthage. And what we discovered is that the Christian response to these epidemics differed in very significant ways from their contemporaries. Instead of running away, instead of neglecting or discarding sick family members and slaves, as Cyprian and Dionysius both testify, Christians stayed with the sick. They engaged in simple nursing. They had no idea, as no one did in antiquity, what a virus was. And I argued 2 weeks ago that the different responses reflected ultimately different beliefs. What you believe, it turns out, makes a difference in how you respond, morally and ethically. And so then we went in search of the belief system, the deep system of values, the underlying logic of early Christian faith that enabled a different response. Last week, we looked at the Epistle of James, and I think a very important moment in 2 Corinthians, one of the letters of Paul. Today and next week, we are going back to the beginning, to the Gospel of Mark and to the sources of Mark's Gospel. When I teach my students at Fordham, when I introduce undergraduates, usually sophomores, sometimes juniors, to early Christianity, I try to express what happened in the early Christian movement by describing it as an awakening. That's the best description that I have. Around the Mediterranean, people, actually ordinary people, many of them quite poor, woke up in the middle of their lives. They stepped out of the anonymity to which the power structure of the Roman Empire had assigned them, the anonymity of work and reproduction. They stepped out of the shadow of fear, fear of disease, fear of tragedy, and fear of the cross if they were slaves, and they became the agents of their own lives. That's the best description that I have of what was happening in early Christianity. And if that is helpful as a description, then clearly the awakening began with a carpenter turned rabbi who, at the age of, Luke says, 30 something, about 30, walked away from the carpenter's bench and began an amazing period of proclamation of the kingdom of God and healing the sick and liberating people from the intolerable constraints that disease, both physical and psychological, places upon the full human dignity that God intended in creation. Now, Peter, back in the fall of 1976, when I enrolled in Yale Divinity School, you can see how badly old I am. Would you believe that in the New Testament interpretation course, which I took then and which you probably took years later, there was no unit devoted to the healing miracles of Jesus? Nothing on the syllabus. Why not? Well, it was the aftermath of rationalism, the legacy of the Enlightenment. The idea of miraculous healing was outside the bounds of a historical and critical, that is to say, rational approach to history. These were viewed as simply folk beliefs that didn't need to be taken very seriously by enlightened people in the late 20th century. Well, all of that has changed. And today, if you were to ask New Testament scholars, what can we say for sure that we know about the historical Jesus? The first thing they would say is that he was a healer. He was a healer. That would be at the top of the list. I saw the change happen in my first teaching position at McCormick Theological Seminary in Chicago in the mid-1980s. I was teaching a Greek class, and we were translating one of the healing miracle stories to which we will devote attention tonight. Mark chapter 7, the healing of the deaf and dumb man. And I presented the healing miracle, focusing on the oral tradition, the literary qualities of the narrative. And a student from Kenya raised her hand and said, Professor Welborn, do you think it really happened, this healing? I was completely discomfited by the question. I really didn't know how to respond. Well, I was still a young professor. And in my awkward silence, the young woman from Kenya said, the reason I ask this question is because I have seen similar things in my own village back home. Now, what scholars discovered in the 1980s is that the rationalistic dismissal of the stories of healing in the Gospels was a part of our cultural hubris. And what we learned after that is that experience is culturally determined. I took a group of 17 master's level students of theology to the north of Brazil in 1992, and we traveled through the cities of the north, Recife, Salvador, Rio, and we made a couple of trips into the Amazon region. On more than one occasion, people with whom we met told us that they had met and conversed with the spirits of their ancestors in the jungles of the Amazon. Well, who am I to say that that did not happen, that that was not part of their experience? So in the early 1980s, New Testament scholars like Howard Clark Key at Boston University, and even more, Gerd Tyson at the University of Heidelberg, paid attention to the stories of healing in the Gospels. And I would still strongly recommend the two books that they wrote, especially Gerd Tyson's book, Miracle Stories in the Early Christian Tradition. And what they learned, of course, when they went back to the ancient sources without their own Enlightenment presuppositions, is that healing was widespread in the ancient world. And we've already learned part of the reason why. Without an understanding of the existence of viruses and bacteria, disease and the recovery from disease, so sickness and healing, were both ascribed to larger forces, to the gods, to supernatural forces. And we've learned that for that reason, when people were sick and there were no hospitals and only the wealthy could afford doctors, people turned to the temples, to the healing gods like Asclepius. But in fact, anyone who was believed to be in possession of divine power, any charismatic, so to speak, was expected to heal. And what scholars like Howard Clark Key and Gerd Tyson discovered in the 1980s is that among the contemporaries of Jesus of Nazareth were a number of healers, holy men who performed healings. The most famous, of course, in antiquity was the holy man Apollonius of Tyana, who healed people of fevers and other diseases. In the Palestinian context, the two most famous healers in the time of Jesus were Hanina bin Doza and Honi the circle drawer. I don't know if anyone has heard of these two healers. They were contemporaries of Jesus of Nazareth. There is a famous story told by the rabbis about Hanina bin Doza healing the son of the famous Rabbi Gamaliel, who was suffering from a fever. Hanina had a strange mechanism or procedure for healing. The rabbis referred to it as descending into the chariot. He put his head between his knees and prayed. The other famous healer of Jesus' day, Honi the circle drawer. Can you guess how he got his name? This is an example of Jewish chutzpah. He drew a circle in the dust, stepped inside the circle, and then challenged the Holy One, blessed be he, to perform a healing. or some other miracle, such as causing it to rain. So Jesus was by no means the only person who performed healings in the ancient world. At the end of our class tonight, with your help, I would like to elicit what made Jesus as a healer different. How did his healings compare with those of his contemporaries? And I think that there are several distinctives. And those distinctions, I think, have implications for us today and how we think of responding to disease. All right, let me stop for a minute just at this point and see if there are questions or comments. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Gospel of Mark and Mark's sources.
A reminder, if you have a question, to unmute yourself at the bottom left of your screen if you're on a computer. You can, if you're on the phone, you can unmute yourself by pressing *6.
So one general question, if you could, let's say in the end of maybe in the 2nd century, or even in the 3rd, what were the communities doing in terms of either reading the Gospels or reading the letters of Paul? How would this be? Would there be readings every week at a liturgy? Would there be discussions? How would they, for example, know about the healing stories? And do we know whether that was an important part of their awakening?
Well, that is such a good question. We know a little bit about how early Christian literature was shared and read within communities. In the Epistle to the Colossians, which may or may not have been written by Paul himself, the author instructs the readers. The author says, when you have read this letter, share it with believers in another city, and you get your hands on the letter that I sent to them. So among the early Christians, there was developing a network of communications, a kind of ancient internet. It turns out that early Christianity was on the cutting edge of the transition from orality to literacy. The early Christians were writing things down almost from the beginning and passing them around. And that's a conclusion that scholars have come to from the hundreds of papyri that have been discovered mainly in Egypt. Now, once a text has been written and read and circulated, there develops a phenomenon that historians call secondary orality. In other words, people don't stop telling stories just because those stories have been committed to writing. And later on tonight, we're going to look at a papyrus text, an unknown gospel, which I think is best explained as an example of secondary orality. Finally, let me point out that by the middle of the 2nd century, the letter exchange between Christians was becoming so rapid. For example, between the church in Rome and the church in Corinth. So Dionysius, the bishop of Corinth, writes to his Roman counterpart, Soter, in about the year 170, and he tells him, we still read in church from time to time the letter that was sent to us by Clement. He's referring to the writing that we call First Clement. So Christian texts like the Gospel of Mark would have been read in the gatherings of early Christians. Most scholars believe that up until the middle of the 2nd century, Christians were assembling in houses. The earliest churches were house churches. In some cases, apartment buildings were probably used. The open air atrium in the center of the apartment building would have been a good place for people to gather. And it's in a place like that that we can picture the Gospel of Mark being read.
Am I on?
Yes, you are.
Just one thing. Is Howard Clark Key the man who was the author of Medicine Miracles and Medicine Miracles in the New Testament?
Yes, you are exactly right.
I wrote a review of that in 1990 for Behavioral Sciences. I haven't heard of it referred to in years, and somewhere stowed in that mess back is both the review and the book, but I remember reading it and understanding, even at the time, that this was different from the kind of New Testament studies that I had previously engaged in, where the historical critical method and Boltzmann was kind of, that's where things began and ended. But then I remember reading this and I don't think the review was among the best things I've ever done by any means, but I realized I was coming upon something very new.
That's fantastic. That's really fantastic. And as you recall, that book was first published in 1984, right? So that's when this was happening, when the paradigm was shifting.
Well, so was I think.
Thank you. That is just fantastic. By the way, I would like to read your review.
Oh God, if I could find it, I probably am. Well, it's in a file someplace.
If you come across it, please scan it and send it to me.
Okay, if I'm not terribly embarrassed, I will.
Recently, I was asked to revisit an essay that I published 36 years ago. That was a frightening experience.
Well, this came through I belong to the Department of Psychiatry's History of Psychiatry section at Weill Cornell Medical College. And they were giving out books to review. How anyone sent this to them, they said, does anyone want to review it for the Journal of Behavioral Sciences, I think. And so I raised my hand and they gave it to me. It wasn't because I had come across, I was noted some great biblical scholar or anything, but I took a whirl. But it was through the Department of Psychiatry and an interest in a Journal of Behavioral Sciences, not a theological journal.
That's fantastic. And you can see from the title how people like Howard Clark Key and Gerd Tyson were beginning to break down the disciplinary barriers, right? Medicine, miracle, and magic,
yes.
right?
Magic, yes.
Magic. A recognition of the fact that in the ancient world, lots of people were expected to heal. People who were sick and didn't understand why, they turned where they could. They turned to doctors, they turned to holy men, they turned to magicians. And by the way, when I was a graduate student at the University of Chicago in the early 1990s, one of the graduate student jobs that I had to do to justify my scholarship, I collaborated with others on the translation of the Greek magical papyri into English. It was eventually published. It was edited by Hans Dieter Betz. And what you find out if you read the Greek magical papyri is that what we would call magicians, but in the ancient world they were holy men, actually sold spells in order to cure various diseases. We'll come back to that later tonight. Other comments or questions before we take the next step?
If I may, Larry, in the famous phrase, the sky hung lower in those days.
Yes, right.
Even as we think of it now, it's difficult, I think, for those of us who are very much historical, critical creatures of the 21st century to put ourselves back into that mindset. So I'm looking forward to hearing more and to perhaps picking up a copy of copies of the books that you've mentioned. It's just a note in passing that this is kind of a big leap for me, maybe for many of us, and facing the issue that we faced in our original conversation in your first class about the expectation that Jesus is going to intervene personally when we have issues of health or any issues that cause us difficulty. So I guess that's as much a comment as a question. We live in a different world, for better or for worse, and that's something I think we just have to cope with and keep interpreting for ourselves.
That's exactly right. And it is so important for us to be careful about the implications that we draw from this ancient material, to take account of the fact that we do live in a different world, and that if we don't take account of the cultural and historical differences, we may twist the text, and the text may do harm rather than good. So that's a very good point. Well, let's talk a little bit about the text. We're turning our attention now to the Gospel of Mark. And by unanimous consent, very few things are unanimous.
Cheer hour here. It's the 7 o'clock cheer for the medical people.
Oh, wonderful. Oh,
Is it anyone else hearing that?
I hear it. Now that you have unmuted, I can hear it.
Yeah.
Oh,
It's
that's
pretty
really
loud.
wonderful.
I'm on the Upper West Side. I just wondered where if other people are hearing it. Yeah, it's supposed to be the whole city.
That's
So,
fantastic.
yeah. Every night, 7.
This is the first time I've had a chance to hear it. Thank you. Wow.
The other day, there was a guy playing a saxophone to accompany it also.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, sure. It's really moving. It is.
Yeah, it's the first time I've had a chance to hear it, and I'm very grateful to you. I've worried so much about my neighbors in the Bronx. I've not been back there since the beginning of December.
Yesterday at noon, I live on the Upper West Side, and for your friends up in the Bronx, there was a jet that flew overhead to salute all the healthcare workers up in the Bronx.
Oh my goodness.
I felt as though my building has 17 stories. I thought the jet was going to take the 17th floor off the top of the building. It was that low.
Thank you for telling me about that. That's wonderful. I've been so heartbroken about it. One of my PhD students, whose apartment is only 1 block from my little apartment in the Bronx, wrote to me about a week ago that the death rate per capita in my neighborhood of the Bronx is the highest, or at least at that time was the highest in the world. So I've been very worried about it.
I guess I was not unmuted at the time. I didn't push the right thing, but I've been hearing the noise outside my apartment here too just now.
Thank you for
Every night at 7 o'clock. Yeah.
7 o'clock. I'm so glad. Thank you for sharing that. Where is your apartment located?
Well, I'm in Jackson Heights, and we don't have anybody playing any musical instruments. But there is one that's been on television, somebody who blows taps every night
Oh,
on
yeah.
a bugle or a trumpet.
Wow. Thank you.
We just got back in from clap, and our block is pretty into it. So hi again.
Good, good. So you went out and joined in the 7 o'clock.
At
Great.
6:55, no matter what, we're out there. We'll be out there tomorrow in the rain.
That's really wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Chip in to the Upper East Side, yes.
We
Thank
will
you
always
for-
be missing class from 6:55 to 7:05.
I live near Lenox Hill Hospital, so it's particularly loud.
Oh, yes, I'm sure.
Lennox
Thank you.
Hill? What was the neighborhood that has taps that somebody plays?
I don't remember where it was.
Oh, I thought it was in one of your neighborhoods.
No. It was mentioned. It was, in fact, they showed him playing the trumpet at least 2 days on the television news here.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Well, we have no musicians. We just have some pot bangers.
That's good. That works for me.
And
Well-
horn honkers.
Yes. So let's take a little step into the text. As you know, I'm sure, the Gospel of Mark is regarded by most scholars as the earliest Christian gospel, probably written not long after the year 70, probably written in Rome by and for people who were living on the wrong side of the Tiber River in Rome, in poor neighborhoods like Trastevere, where the Vatican, by the way, is today. 2,000 years ago, that was a dock area populated mainly by Jews and Egyptians and other immigrants. Quite a poor area. And that's where many scholars would locate the composition of the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of Mark abounds in stories of Jesus's healing. And in the 1970s, a remarkable American New Testament scholar, I know you think Germans created New Testament studies, but there was an American who taught in Virginia named Paul Ochtmeyer. And he succeeded in a spectacular literary analysis of the Gospel of Mark and demonstrated to the satisfaction of, I think, the majority of scholars that embedded within the Gospel of Mark are two primitive collections of miracle stories. The two collections are parallel. Each one begins with a water miracle, followed by 3 healings, and concluded by a miraculous feeding. Have you ever puzzled, Peter, over why there are 2 miraculous feedings in the Gospel of Mark? First, Jesus feeds 5,000, then he feeds 4,000. Well, that seems anticlimactic. Couldn't he feed as many the second time? And what Paul Ochtmeyer demonstrated is that the author of what we call the Gospel of Mark has preserved and incorporated into his gospel 2 primitive collections of miracle stories. And Ochtmeyer further argued, and this comes back to one of the good questions that one of you asked a few minutes ago. Octomar demonstrated that the situation in the life of the early Christian community where these stories of healing were shared was worship. And it can hardly be an accident that each of the miracle cycles begins with a water miracle and ends with what? A feeding miracle. You don't have to be an expert to figure out what that refers to. Baptism and Eucharist. And so Octomar argued that at the assemblies of the early Christians, when they met to break bread together, to baptize new converts, stories of Jesus's healing were told. And in the telling, his life-changing power was made present, was made palpable. I think that's a brilliant hypothesis. Most scholars, I think, were persuaded by it, and you can tell I certainly am persuaded by it. Now, with that as the context, that literary analysis, I would like to turn to the first healing story in Mark's Gospel, right at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Following the baptism of Jesus, Jesus returns from the wilderness and he calls disciples. He teaches in a synagogue in a little town called Capernaum in the lower Galilee. He teaches on the Sabbath. And then, still on the Sabbath day, Mark chapter 1, verses 29 to 31, the first healing story in the Gospel of Mark. And the translation that I'm going to be sharing with you all is my own translation. It's a very literal one, and you may find it interesting to compare my translation with the one that Peter has so helpfully put up on the screen. Well, here's my literal translation. And immediately, going out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. And the mother-in-law of Simon was lying down, burning with a fever. The Greek word is puresso. If we were all together there at St. Bart's, I would ask you to say it with me. Puresso. It's actually a technical medical word. It is used by the great Hippocrates in the Hippocratic documents. It means to burn with a fever. It designates a very high, life-threatening fever. So the mother-in-law of Simon Peter is prostrate with a burning fever. And immediately they speak to him about her. And going to her, he raised her up, taking hold of her hand. Now, the Greek word that is translated taking hold is the verb krateo. And it means literally to establish close contact. But it is also used of overcoming obstacles. It denotes taking control of a situation or a person. And the text continues, and the fever, puretos, the noun form, burning fever. According to Galen uses this word. The fever left her, and she began to serve them. Now the formula, and the fever left her, or literally departed, went out from her, suggest that the fever is understood to be an entity that can enter a human body and leave a human body, like an unclean spirit. We have to remind ourselves that without any knowledge of virus or bacteria, disease was mysterious. There was something daimonic about it, and I'm not using the word daimonic here in the modern or medieval sense of a devil, a demon. I'm using daimonic in the ancient sense of something above the human, something spiritual. There was something mysterious about disease in the ancient world. And by the way, I think we have to acknowledge that even for us now facing the coronavirus, there is a great deal that is mysterious about it. Doctors all over the world, researchers are trying to understand it, but the mystery is reflected even in the language that we use. We refer to it as a novel coronavirus. That's a way of speaking about what we don't know, what we have not experienced before. The other point that I want to make here has to do with the importance of touch in the healing stories about Jesus. Later tonight, we will see that it is a consistent feature of these stories. Jesus heals not at a distance by uttering some wonder-working word, but he heals by touch. And in this story of the healing of Simon's mother-in-law, notice that no healing word is spoken. Instead, he takes hold of her by the hand and raises her up. Now, let me stop there for just a minute and ask you to think with me about the implications of Jesus reaching out and touching the sick, making contact, the importance of contact. Now we are practicing out of concern and care for our fellow citizens. We are practicing social distancing, and we are staying as far away as we can from people to whom the virus might be spread. That's because we know something more now about virus than they did in the time of Jesus. But there are other ways of making contact, of reaching out. The rector of the Episcopal Church where I worship most frequently here in Dayton shared with me this past week that she is encouraging all of us to buy gift cards, grocery store gift cards, for the front line medical workers, people who are responding to emergency. That's an example of continuing the practice of contact that we see in the healings of Jesus. Let me stop there for a minute and ask for comments or questions.
A comment, Larry. Some years ago, I had some surgery, and there was it was kind of painful afterward. And I remember kind of grimacing in pain. And one of the nurses, my wife was not there at that particular moment. One of the nurses came over and took my hand. And I was just so touched by that. And I remember it to this day. And it brings to mind also what I've read in these terrible COVID-19 days about near relatives. People are near death. They're in ventilators. The end is near. And this terrible thing that the families are not allowed in to see them. Nobody, spouse, children, anybody. And we hear stories of nurses, medical professionals, taking people's hands
Yes.
at the end, just as a way of physically supporting them, comforting them. And I just think that it's so powerful, and brought to mind again by what you just shared with us from Mark.
It is so powerful. I agree with you. When I've heard those stories, when I get up and turn on the news in the morning, it just brings tears to your eyes. And like you, I had an experience. The first serious surgery that I had in my life, back in 2001, I was scheduled to preach in the chapel of the seminary, where this was before I came to Fordham. And I was worried, anxious that I would be going into the hospital the very next morning to have major surgery. One of my faculty colleagues, Andrew Park, a Korean theologian, was seated with me up in the pulpit area of the chapel. He was going to read the scripture before my sermon, and he could tell, I suppose, that I was distressed, and he reached out and took my hand and held my hand until the time came for me to get up and preach. And now, Peter, can I tell you that when I stood up to preach, I was no longer anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, you know, I have a special bond with Andrew Park because he touched me. He reached out and took my hand and held it. It was the first time I'd ever held hands with another man, but it was beautiful and wonderful. And I'm so grateful to him. Yes, please.
I was struck by your translation in which you say that Jesus lifted her up.
Yes.
That was the first thing, and then took her hand.
Yes.
And it felt to me like the lifting up of the Eucharist at our celebration, or the lifting up in prayer.
Yes.
And I just wondered if that movement upward contributes to the healing and contributes to the Spirit leaving.
You're absolutely right. The Greek verb is egerein, which literally means to raise up, but guess what? It is the same word that is used for the resurrection of Jesus. When Paul says God raised Jesus out of the dead, he uses that verb, egero, egerein. So, yeah, the word resonates. He raised her up and then took hold of her hand. Thank you. That's a very insightful comment.
Another point is that I'm a Reiki practitioner.
Oh, yes. I know what it is.
It's a form of energetic healing that's really used a lot in the Far East. And I'm a hospice volunteer. And in hospitals now, Reiki is now being used. And here in America, it's called more healing touch. But I was once working with a patient who had metastasized cancer. And she had hot water bottles. Her aide put hot water bottles on her body where she had pain.
Yes.
And when I would go to do the Reiki with her, she would slowly take one bottle after another off. And she said it was the only time that she didn't feel pain.
Yes. Wonderful. My younger son was on a school trip willing workers on organic farms in the Far East. His leg was very badly hurt. He was cutting some wood and the log fell on his leg. And there was a person there who came over and performed Reiki healing on his leg. And my younger son is not a romantic person. He's not given to exaggerating. He says that he could feel the warmth in his leg, and before long he was able to stand up and walk.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that. Well, let's take another step and we will come back then. The next part of the text, chapter 1, verses 32 to 34. When evening had come, when the sun had already set. So now it is finally no longer the Sabbath. They brought to him all those who were sick. The Greek expression here, kakos echontes, literally means all those doing poorly, those who are bad off. So they brought to him all those who were doing poorly and those who were possessed by a daimonic force, and he healed. And the Greek verb is therapeuo, which is the word from which we get what? Therapy. So literally, he provided therapy. Many who were sick with various kinds of diseases, and he cast out many daimones, and he would not permit the daimones to speak because they knew him. I want to point out that some manuscripts, some very valuable manuscripts, at this point have, because they knew that he was the Messiah. The spiritual forces had insight, in other words. Now, the fact that the people of Capernaum waited until the sun had gone down to bring the sick to Jesus implies that they were observing the Sabbath, just as Jews, just as observant Jews still do today. In fact, you may be interested to know that when we appointed 2 Jewish faculty members in our department at Fordham, the Department of Theology, we then implemented an email Sabbath. So no one in the theology department is permitted to send out an email between sunset on Friday evening and sunset on Saturday evening, an email Sabbath. It's actually very healthy and civilized. So the people of Capernaum wait until the Sabbath is over before they bring the sick to Jesus. I think that's clearly an implication of the text, but there is a second implication of here. Remember that Mark's Jesus has just healed earlier in the day on the Sabbath. He has healed Simon Peter's mother-in-law. So Mark's Jesus heals on the Sabbath. And we will find more evidence of that later in the text. But I think the inference is crucial, and it's worth talking about. It's worth our discussing. One way of drawing the inferences might be this, that for Jesus, compassion is more important than purity, more important than preserving the letter of the law. Well, let me stop at that point for a minute and invite you all to reflect about that. This point of the fact that Jesus heals on the Sabbath. He breaks the Sabbath in order to respond to people who are in need. And for us today, I think as a church, maybe it's worth thinking about. When the rector of one of our Episcopal churches here in Southwest Ohio made the difficult decision at the beginning of the coronavirus outbreak to cancel in-person gatherings for Sunday morning worship, for Eucharist. And the rector sent out an email to all of us, and she said, I have decided that compassion at this moment is more important than tradition. Our tradition is to always meet together for Eucharist, but compassion overrides tradition at this moment. Well, let me see if others have thoughts along those lines.
Well, last night, I think it was last night, the Hasidic Jews of Williamsburg went into Williamsburg, Brooklyn. They gathered for a funeral of a rabbi, and our mayor had to send the cops and send them home, you know. And they've had a very high incidence because of all the group activities they do. So that's an indication of sort of where they're, you know, I guess since he was a rabbi, they've had a lot of deaths due to COVID.
Yes.
Do you know about this? Do you know about this that she's talking about?
Oh, yes. It's been all over the news here.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, here in
well, you saw that there were like at least 200 people.
Yes.
And some of them weren't masks, even wearing masks, and they were sitting right next to one another. And you've got to wonder where, you know, this is where the power of, well, we were talking about religious communities here.
Right.
You know, and the Jewish religious community in Jesus's time and in our time is very, very strong community.
Yes.
And even today, you see, we have some of these people, and there were some churches also in our country that had everybody getting together and coming to church and and you wonder, what do they really want to take their lives in their hands and get together in big groups like this?
Right. I think the point is a very profound point, that compassion has to override tradition. And I don't know enough about the details of the rabbi's funeral, but one thing I will say about our governor, the governor of the state of New York, have you not been impressed with what a good Catholic he is, and how he repeatedly refers to the life and the religious traditions of his family as a guiding star for how he makes difficult decisions.
Well, his father was amazing, Mario Como.
Oh, his father was amazing. His father should have been president.
I didn't want to.
Well, and his brother, his younger brother, has been sick with the virus now.
I know.
So you may have seen him on CNN
Yes.
the last couple of weeks talking about what he went through.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, it's hitting very close to Cuomo's heart, you see.
Right. You know, I think this is a matter, this lesson, you know, that maybe we can draw here by implication from Jesus about compassion outweighing tradition, even religious traditions. This is something for us as a church to think about.
The interesting thing, Larry, is that this has been, as David mentioned, it has been framed in different language than tradition versus compassion. It's been framed in the language of religious liberty, and how dare the government tell us we can or cannot need to worship. Our own rector, Dean Wolfe, has been more than contemptuous of the megachurch clergy who have insisted on meeting, gathering their congregations, despite the peril that they put those congregations in. So it's just worth noting that tradition is one hallmark, and political affiliation is another thing that keeps emerging unhappily in our day.
You're absolutely right.
I sent Dean's sermon a couple weeks ago where he said everybody who thinks they're immune from this ought to get down on their knees and pray for forgiveness. And everybody, it was an explosion of, you know, yes, that's true.
Oh, that's really profound. Thank you for sharing that. I wish I'd heard that sermon. That's really profound. Please tell the rector that Larry Welborn thanks thanks him for that.
Just in terms of what we've been reading, they may not have known about viruses and bacteria, but they use this unclean spirit thing an awful lot. And I was wondering, you know, why they chose those words. I mean, what is clean to them?
Yes, thank you. The ancient idea was that the body was permeable. It could be penetrated by larger daimonic or spiritual forces. And you're quite right that other texts that we will examine together next week, other texts speak about an unclean spirit. Now, the texts that we've been looking at today don't use that language. They use the language of daimones, which are spiritual forces. The daimones are located between the mortal realm and Mount Olympus and the transcendent gods. But your very good question about unclean spirits, could you hold on to that question for next week?
Sure. Yeah.
All right, let's take another step into the text.
May I add one other thing?
Yes, please.
I always thought that the unclean spirits, once that was drawn out by Jesus, it allowed for a reconciliation with God. That part of the demonic spirit was that which keeps us from being with and in communion with God. And I also thought that the reason that Jesus was healing on the Sabbath was to get the attention of the Pharisees, to get the attention of the rabbis, to show them that compassion was a form of worship, that compassion is a form of bringing people back into communion with God. So I thought it was kind of an intentional selection of time and place.
That's a very interesting point. A text that we will not have time to look at tonight, I wish we did, is the story of the healing of the paralytic. You remember this paralyzed man? The house where Jesus is teaching is surrounded by people. And the paralytic has 4 friends. They bring him to the house and they can't even get in the front door. So they unroof the roof and they lower the paralytic into the room to the feet where Jesus is teaching. Now, it happens to be the case that this was the Sabbath, and Jesus heals the man on the Sabbath. And you're absolutely right, it provokes an angry and outraged reaction from people who are standing there. But once again, you are really onto something, and I'm just going to ask you to hold on to it for next week, if that's possible. Peter, are you still there?
I am.
Good. Let me take another step then into the text. Chapter 1, verses 35 to 39. And arising early in the morning, while it was still very dark, he went out, that is to say, went out of the house, and departed to a deserted place. And there he began to pray. And they pursued him, Simon and those with him, and they found him. And they say to him, all are seeking you. And he says to them, let us go elsewhere, to the neighboring market towns, so that I may proclaim there also. For it was for this purpose that I came out. And he was proclaiming in their synagogues in the whole of Galilee, and he was casting out daimones. Now, there are 2 points that I want to make here. First, the need that Jesus clearly feels for temporary isolation, for temporary withdrawal. He goes out into a deserted place, and the need that he feels for prayer. The Greek verb that is used there is in the imperfect tense, which denotes continuous action. In other words, Jesus feels the need for isolation and prayer in order to be able to continue the work of healing. The second point I want to make is in response to my friend, the charismatic New Testament scholar who frequently appears on the History Channel, John Dominic Crossan. Crossan has suggested that when Simon Peter tries to drag Jesus back to his home, that Simon is attempting to make himself the broker, so to speak, of the kingdom of God by localizing the healing power of Jesus in his own home. Well, if that is a valid inference about what is going on in the text, then I think there are implications for today. Jesus is clearly opposed to the idea that any one place or any one person can be the locus of God's healing love. He tells the disciples, let's go on to the next market town. That is the reason that I came out. And I think that has implications for us today, for us as a church. How can we make sure that we are sharing the healing work of Jesus and that we are not trying to be the brokers in the process? Now, Peter, I have to tell you, I've lost the visual part of the Zoom, so I need to be reassured that you're all still there.
Yes.
We are still here, yes.
Good.
You probably just have to find the window.
Okay. All right. Looking at the time, I'm going to press on to the next text. Chapter 1, verses 40 to 45. And a leper came to him, appealing to him, falling on his knees before him, and saying to him, if you will, so if you want it, you are able to make me clean. And he, that is Jesus, felt a wrenching in his guts. It's a literal translation of the Greek verb splunknitsomai. And stretching out his hand, watch, here it's coming again, the touch, the contact, he touched him and said to him, I do wish it. I do want it. Be made clean. And immediately the leprosy departed, went out from him. And now my translation is going to differ significantly from the one that you're looking at on the screen. I would translate the next verse, and being deeply moved by him, that is by the leper, immediately he sent him away. And he said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for yourself, for your cleansing, what Moses commanded as proof for them. But when he had gone away, he began to proclaim energetically and to spread the word widely, so that Jesus was no longer able to enter a city openly, but remained outside in unpopulated places. And they were coming to him from everywhere. Now, there are 3 points I want to lift up before once again I ask for you to join the discussion. First, the disease. The Greek word for it is lepra. It is a serious skin disease, possibly including what we today call leprosy. Greek medical writers actually include a variety of skin diseases under the term lepra. In fact, there is abundant evidence that not all the lepra mentioned in the Bible is leprosy as we know it today. That is the disease that is caused by Hansen's bacillus. In fact, many scholars hold that Hansen's disease was unknown in the ancient world, or that it was known by a different name than lepra. So it's important for us to realize that in the New Testament and in the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, the term lepra probably extends to cover psoriasis, ringworm, lupus, and favus. Now, there is a unknown gospel that was discovered in Egypt about 100 years ago. It's called Papyrus Egerton number 2. Mr. Egerton was a wealthy Brit who paid for the archaeological expedition that discovered the papyrus and who brought the papyrus back to England. In Papyrus Egerton number 2, there is a slightly different version of the story that we have just read in Mark. And my old mentor, Helmut Kester from Harvard, believed and argued that the version of the story found in Papyrus Egerton is actually older than Mark. Anyway, here's what it says. And behold, someone with lepra approached him and said, "Teacher Jesus, while I was traveling with others who had lepra, and while I was eating with them at the inn, I myself contracted lepra." The second point I want to lift up has to do with Jesus's very evident emotional involvement in the suffering of the man with lepra. That is signaled by two Greek words. The first one, splanknizomai, which literally means a wrenching in the guts. The Greek word for the guts or bowels is the word splankna. So what Jesus felt when he saw the man with lepra was a tugging in his guts. And then the second word, which is where my translation differs so significantly, is the verb embriaomai. If we were together, I'd ask you to say that with me, embriaomai. And it has two meanings. It can mean warn sternly. That's the way it's translated in the text that you're probably looking at. But there is a second meaning, and I think it is much better justified in context. The second meaning is be deeply moved. Embriaomai describes literally the boiling up of emotion within the breast of a person. So that's my second point, the emotional involvement of Jesus in the suffering. And now the third point, once again, obviously, the contact, the touch. And this is emphasized by Mark when he says, having extended his hand, he touched. And the verb that is used here for touch is the Greek verb hapto, which doesn't just mean to touch. It means to take hold of. In fact, it actually means to cling to. And I could give lots of examples of that. So let me see at this point if there are questions or comments about this wonderful story, the 3 points that we have made, the nature of the skin disease, the emotional involvement of Jesus in the suffering, and Mark's emphasis upon the contact that
I'd like to ask something. This is a very famous story. It has always been the healing of the leper. Now, are there other stories in other Gospels of him healing where it says definitely leprosy?
No. In fact, there is no other word for a serious skin disease than the word lepra.
Because leprosy is not necessarily a skin disease. Well, this was that's one of the most important things about understanding this to me, in that in the ancient world, leprosy was the incurable disease, and it was contagious.
Right.
As opposed to other skin diseases or whatever.
Right.
And that if you had leprosy, you were put into a colony. And that was true even 100 years or so ago in the world, where people lived in leper colonies. And if they came out of the leper colony, they had to say, wherever they went, they had to cover themselves up and they had to yell, unclean, unclean.
Yes.
And everybody would run away from them. This was often used in ancient Roman and Greek comedies, and Roman comedies primarily.
Yes.
They're making fun of the lepers because they were unclean. But that word unclean, that goes back to the old idea that people had unclean spirits. And if you are sick, there's something in you that's sinful, that God is punishing. That idea goes way back to antiquity too, doesn't it?
It does. And everything you've said is absolutely correct. It is clear that the word lepra can describe what we would today refer to as Hansen's disease, which is highly contagious. And the gospel, the Papyrus Egerton 2 that I just read clearly indicates that this man is suffering from something that's contagious, that is communicable. He explains to Jesus, while I was traveling with other people who had lepra, and while I was eating with them at the inn, I contracted it.
Well, then it would not be a regular skin disease. It must
be. You can't get, that's right. You can't get psoriasis simply by touching a person who has it. At least I don't think you can.
I have just a general comment, if I might make. I don't know if I mentioned this last week or not, but I really enjoy reading and rereading a book by Dr. Daniel Henshaw, who is a palliative care physician, retired. And the name of his book is Touch and the Healing of the World. And it's published by St. Vladimir's Seminary Press.
Oh, good.
But it meditates on a series of icons that are relevant, including this one on Jesus and the leper, but several other of those accounts also. But it's a wonderful thing to read these meditations by someone also who is somewhat familiar with the Greek and at the same time is a physician. And so that combination, Touch and the Healing of the World, it's a wonderful book, really.
Thank you so much for that. The title is Touch and the Healing of the World.
correct, by Dr. Daniel Hinshaw, Hinshaw.
Thank you. I'm
Yes.
grateful for that. I'm going to get it.
What the one part of a sentence that leaps out to me is if you choose to.
Right.
Is that the only time that someone who needed healing framed their request that way? Because the wording seems very singular. If you choose to.
It is.
Heal me.
It is. You're absolutely right. It's the only healing story I know of in the gospel where the person who comes to Jesus seeking for healing frames it in that way. It's the Greek verb thelo, which means to wish or to want, to have the volition to do something. I don't know of any other story. And what's so moving to me is that Mark says that Jesus felt a wrenching in his guts, and Jesus said, I do wish it. I do want it. One of the things I love about Mark's portrayal of Jesus is his extreme humanity, his emotional response to situations. We don't have time to look at it tonight, but there's a beautiful story in Mark chapter 5. Jesus is summoned to the house of a leader of the Jews, and his little daughter is gravely ill and is at the point of death. I'm sure you know the story. It's in Mark chapter 5. And by the time Jesus arrives at the house, the little girl has died. And people are coming out of the house weeping. And they say to the little girl's father, send the rabbi away. She's dead. We don't have need of him anymore. And it is very clear in the Greek that Jesus cannot accept emotionally. He can't accept the fact that she is dead. And he turns to the parents and he says, take me to the little girl's room. And he puts everyone else out of the room except for the parents. And then once again, by means of touch, he takes the little girl's hand and he says to her in the language, her native language that she would have learned at her mother's knee, he says, Talitha kumi, little girl, rise up. It's such a beautiful picture of, that it's Mark's Jesus that I really love. He cannot accept the fact, he won't accept it, that the little girl has died. I'm afraid, Peter, we may be running out of time, but let me suggest to the class that if you would like to go ahead and read the final story that I wanted to look at for tonight is Mark chapter 7, verses 32 to 37. It's the healing of a man who is deaf and has a speech impediment. And I'm sure you're familiar with the story. What I wanted to focus on is the elaborate measures to which Jesus goes in healing the man. He takes him apart from the crowd privately. He puts his fingers in the man's ears. And then the text says that Jesus spit, the Greek verb, onomatopoetic verb, patuo, and he touched the man's tongue. And then the text says, looking up into heaven, he sighed deeply and said to him, Ephphatha, an Aramaic word, which Mark translates for his Greek readers, be opened. And the point I wanted to make about this fascinating text is that the portrayal of Jesus' healing activity here is so popular. It is so close to folk religion and folk healing that evidently Matthew, who is a good Jewish Christian, wanted nothing to do with this story. He knew about it. He summarizes it in one verse. but he deletes all of the quasi-magical manipulations, the spitting, the looking up to heaven, the sighing deeply, the pronouncing of a word with force, ephatha, be open. There's a lot we could say about this story, but the point I wanted to make is this. What we see here is a picture of Jesus who, in his passion, in his emotional commitment to responding to the sick, took the risk of associating himself with a very questionable social type: the folk healer, the shaman, the magician. He reaches all the way out to the common people, the ordinary people, who turn to him in search of healing, and accommodates his method of healing to their expectations and their needs. I think there are all kinds of implications for us there. Peter, I see it's 7:59. And as I said, I don't have the picture anymore. Does anyone have a response, a comment before we have to go?
I do.
I have a comment. Oh,
Please, please.
I think that by showing the people that he could do what the local shamans could do,
Yes.
is saying you don't need to abandon traditionally where you've gone to be healed. I can heal you in that way and more.
Thank you. I told you that when I was a graduate student, I had to translate the Greek magical papyri. And all of the language that is used here in this text, spitting, putting fingers in the ears, looking up into heaven and sighing deeply to draw in the divine force, spitting, all of this has parallels in the Greek magical papyri. So, we really see a graphic picture here of Jesus as a folk healer.
Professor Welborn, maybe next week, if you don't have time this week, could you tell us what might have been expected of a Jewish rabbi as a healer?
Thank you.
In this context? I mean, we get it that he's willing to sort of go out on a limb and be non-traditional, but I have really no understanding of what a traditional rabbi would do, except maybe he wouldn't do it on the Sabbath.
Yes, thank you very much. I will come back to that point in greater detail next week, but just quickly now, I would say that the stories of the healings that were performed by Hanina Mendoza do not include touch. They don't include manipulation of the body as we see here. He heals by putting his head between his knees and praying fervently. And the other point I would make just quickly is that all of the stories of Hanina Mendoza, who is a healer for the rabbis, the stories that survive about him depict him healing the legal experts, the rabbis, the priest, the professionals. It's only in the case of Jesus that we have stories of Jesus healing the unwashed masses. Mark's word is aklos. And the Greek word aklos is not the same as the Greek word for common people. The word for common people is demos. Aklos is the mob. It's the rabble. It's the down and out. And those are the people to whom Jesus is responding in Mark's gospel. There's a very interesting manuscript variant in Codex Beza Cantabrigiensis, the account of Jesus healing the man with the withered hand. Do you remember that story?
Yes.
In Codex Beza, the man with the withered hand says to Jesus, I was a stonemason, so an ordinary stone cutter, and I made my living with my hands. Please heal me. I mean, these are the kind of people. Or the woman with the hemorrhage in Mark chapter 5, who has suffered for 12 years and who tells Jesus, I spent everything I had with the doctors. And only then, when she's completely broke and down and out, does she turn to Jesus. So there are some things about the healings that Jesus performs that are distinctive. One of those things is Jesus's avoidance of publicity. Hanina Mendoza's healing of the son of Rabbi Gamaliel was done in public. Everyone knew about it. But notice in our text for tonight, the deaf and dumb man, Mark says, Jesus took him apart from the crowd. And then Mark emphasizes it again with a little Greek expression, katidian, which means privately. So Jesus is not seeking publicity for what he's doing. He's healing in private.
Isn't that the messianic secret?
You know what? The great New Testament scholar William Rada believed that it was the messianic secret, and there's no doubt he is partly correct. Nowadays, New Testament scholars would tell you that the secrecy, the privacy of Jesus's healings was anchored in the tradition. But the author of Mark's gospel took that and thematized it, expanded it, and made it into a factor in Jesus's presentation of his identity. But most New Testament scholars would tell you today that the avoidance of publicity was anchored in the tradition. That, in other words, it's older than Mark's editorial theology.
Well, we're after 8 o'clock, so I want to make sure folks have time to do whatever else they need to do tonight. But we do have 2 more sessions left with Professor Welborn, so we look forward to seeing you back here same time next week. Anything you want to add, Professor Welborn?
No, I just want to say how grateful I am for our class, for every single member of our group, the comments, so thoughtful and insightful. Thank you for asking me to join you in doing this.
We're so grateful that you're here, and we look forward to seeing all of you next week. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you. Peace.